I figure you might already see me as a total moron, a clueless, dim-witted husband, but the truth is, in hindsight, everything always seems obvious, and like most happily married men, I loved and trusted my wife. I never suspected that the woman I adored and had shared 8 years of deep intimacy and countless joyful memories with would turn out to be a selfish cheat. Well, one of the 3 selfish cheats, to be exact. Jessica's 2 sisters had been part of my life ever since our very first date. I'd never encountered identical triplets before, and seeing 3 stunningly similar women was as unnerving as it was exhilarating. When I went to pick Jessica up at her apartment, we ran into her at the grocery store. I remember her asking me to grab a box of herbal tea from the top shelf, a task well suited for someone my size, since Jessica stands around 5'7" and has a curvy figure with sleek jet black hair cropped just above her ears, while I'm a bit taller at around 6'. It wasn't until our 4th date that I learned she'd noticed me in the produce section, thinking I was cute, and had been patiently waiting by the tea aisle for me to help her out. I found that pretty flattering, especially since she revealed the secret while we were tangled up in each other's arms after our first night together. Our early dates were nothing short of magical. We'd have dinner that lasted until nearly 11 p.m., take leisurely walks in the park feeding the ducks, and even catch those cheesy chick flicks while holding hands the whole time. I was completely entranced by Jessica. She was, without a doubt, the most beautiful girl I had ever laid eyes on. A sweet, sexy neighbor-next-door type with a smile that could warm the coldest heart. After fetching her tea at that store, she'd chat with me in that dreamy, half-teasing way that made me feel like I was starring in my own movie. I was over the moon when I set up our next date for the following Friday. During that call, she made a vague reference to having sisters, but I never expected to meet not one, but 3 gorgeous Jessicas. When I arrived at her place, one of the girls swung open the door with a cheerful, "Hello, you must be Scott," and added with a laugh, "You don't know me, I'm Ashley." I was completely tongue-tied as she joked, "No, I'm not Jessica. I'm Ashley, and Brittany and Jessica are my sisters. Didn't I mention us?" I must have mentioned something vaguely because, for some inexplicable reason, I hadn't heard about the twins. Ashley laughed again, saying that Jessica liked to mess with you every now and then. "I'll go get her," she added. In the living room, I soon spotted Brittany, and of course, all 3 looked identical. Same haircuts, same figures, same dazzling smiles. So I couldn't tell them apart until Jessica emerged from one of the bedrooms with a bright, "Hello, Scott. Would you like a nice cup of herbal tea?" Over our first dinner together, we chatted about everything under the sun. I was especially fascinated by her life as one of the triplets. I peppered her with questions about what it was like constantly seeing 2 other versions of yourself, whether it was disconcerting or comforting, and if you ever played mind games like identical twins sometimes do. Jessica told me we were incredibly close, almost as if we could read each other's minds, though she admitted we'd occasionally switched identities just for fun. "You ever notice we all rock the same hairstyles?" she said with a knowing smile. I nodded, and she explained how, as little girls, they'd love fooling people. Teachers, relatives, even their own parents couldn't tell them apart. It was all fun and games until one of them got in trouble and tried to dodge a spanking by claiming, "No, Dad, I'm not Brittany, I'm Jessica." Their parents must have gone bonkers, she joked. In high school, they even tried to be different by sporting different hairstyles, taking different classes, and joining different clubs. Me, for example. I took the yearbook staff while Brittany wrote for the school paper and Ashley played field hockey. But eventually they all craved that unmistakable bond, so sometimes I'd even take a test for one or watch as the other presented for me. It all helped our grades, believe it or not. I remember a time in junior year when a guy named Jake Miller asked Brittany out. She was smitten with him, but when she came down with the flu on the day of their date, she was inconsolable, sobbing and moaning that he'd never ask her out again if she had to cancel. In the end, she convinced me to pose as her for one evening. It wasn't difficult since it was their first date and they hardly knew each other anyway. That little stunt worked out fine, and Brittany ended up dating him for nearly a year without ever revealing that I had stepped into her shoes. Looking back now, I admit I recall that story with a sour taste, but at the time I was sitting across from a charming, delightful girl who made me feel like I was in a fairy tale. And the fact that she seemed to be into me too was nothing short of miraculous. After college, all three sisters moved back to Cincinnati and shared a spacious apartment. It was at this apartment that I went to pick up Jessica for a date, the same date where I first met her sisters. Fast forward 8 years. Jessica and I dated, fell deeply in love, and tied the knot 2 years later. I thought I was the luckiest guy on earth. I landed a solid job at a graphic design firm where my computer skills made me a real asset, and we could easily afford a nice 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just a few miles from downtown. You won't be surprised to hear who our neighbors were. 3 years into our marriage, Brittany married a tall, somewhat dull fellow named Kevin, who worked in finance. He was friendly enough, if not particularly exciting, and they ended up living next door to us on a quiet cul-de-sac called Ferdinand Place. Across the yard, overlooking our backyard, lived none other than Ashley with her husband Derek, a few years older than us, a short and cheerful guy who owned several bowling alleys in the Cincinnati area. Derek used to puff on cigars until Ashley convinced him to quit, and he'd tell off-color jokes that made him great company. They got married just a few months before Kevin and Brittany did, and it wasn't a surprise to any of us that our wives insisted on living so close together. They were like Siamese triplets, always together. Kevin, Derek, and I quickly got used to them finishing each other's sentences and meeting every evening, practically every night, for a chat before heading off to bed. Even after 8 years with Jessica, I could never be entirely sure which of the triplets was which, and Kevin and Derek admitted they had the same trouble. We became experts at noticing which necklace or outfit each wore. At a Christmas dinner with their parents, it was as clear as day that even they struggled to tell their daughters apart. That said, their personalities were distinct. Brittany was a bit tougher and more prim and conservative, while Ashley was the wild one. She drank a little more, cracked off-color jokes, and was voted most likely to end up as a topless bar dancer, though I never saw her do it. Jessica fell somewhere in between, sweeter and more outgoing than Brittany, yet more level-headed than Ashley. When we were all together, you could sense the differences, but it was nearly impossible to tell who was who by face or voice alone. It was almost as if, when they wanted to pull a fast one on you, you had no chance of figuring it out. Since we didn't have kids yet, planning vacations was a breeze. As you might imagine, Jessica and her sisters insisted on taking a family trip every summer, a 2-week getaway with all 6 of us, whether it was to Las Vegas, a North Carolina beach resort, or even Italy for 1 year. We were a pretty compatible group, so the husbands didn't mind. But in return, I insisted on a solo week with Jessica every year. Just the 2 of us, no sisters, no in-laws. At first, this demand sparked heated arguments and long, cold silences, but after 3 years, Jessica finally understood. "I love your sisters and have fun with Kevin and Derek," I'd explain, "but I need a week that's just for us." I must have repeated myself about 10 times before she finally relented. The day before our Italian getaway, when she came home from work and noticed I hadn't even started packing, that argument broke out one last time. I stood firm. If she wouldn't agree to spend 1 week alone with me, I'd stay home. After over an hour of shouting and 20 frantic phone calls to Brittany and Ashley to calm me down, Jessica finally conceded, and we went to Italy. For a few days, the air was icy between us, with her sisters making it clear I was in the doghouse, but thanks to some encouragement from Derek and Kevin, who secretly celebrated my win, since it meant they'd get similar proposals from their wives, The romance of Florence eventually thawed the tension. The rest of the trip was as amazing as our winter getaway on Sanibel Island. After that, every year we enjoyed 2 weeks with Jessica's sisters and one wonderful week without them. Now, you might think everything was picture perfect, but the trouble began when Jessica and I decided to have kids. We both knew we'd eventually start a family, but we were so busy enjoying our life as a couple, albeit one perpetually entangled with 2 extra couples, that we didn't rush it. However, when Jessica and her sisters turned 30 and I was 32, the biological clock began ticking. Jessica stopped taking her pills, and within a couple of months, she and I started trying for a baby. I never had an issue with the idea. After all, I'd always cherished the intimacy with my amazing wife. Our sex was usually tender and intimate rather than rough or wild. We had a few favorite positions, though the nights when we'd experiment playfully dwindled as the years went by. Every so often, Jessica would surprise me by coming to bed in a fiery mood, and we'd end up having multiple sessions in one night. We'd always celebrate birthdays or anniversaries with champagne, which only heightened her passion, but mostly our lovemaking was gentle, and that suited me just fine. Then one night, after what I can only describe as a rough encounter, I half-jokingly remarked about it later, I discovered that Jessica wasn't a fan of such rough play. It was a Saturday, and after I got home from the grocery store with dinner ingredients, I heard her calling from the bedroom. There, I found her lying on her stomach, naked, clutching a bottle of massage oil. "I'm feeling a bit stressed today, cowboy," she muttered. "Could you give me a hand?" I worked on her back and legs until she sighed with relief. Then I flipped her over and started pleasuring her with my fingers, lips, and tongue until she climaxed 3 times. We then had intense, passionate sex until I finally reached my peak. Afterward, we lay together dreamily, while Jessica fetched us some snacks from the kitchen. Dinner was forgotten, and soon we were back in each other's arms. When I joked about possibly switching things up, teasing, "Maybe you aren't Jessica tonight. Maybe I got lucky with Ashley or Brittany instead," Jessica's smile froze, and she glared. "Scott, this isn't funny. Do you really think I'd ever share you with my sisters?" she snapped. I tried to apologize, saying, "I'm sorry, honey, I was just joking." But she pulled away and declared she was off to take a shower, locking herself in the bathroom. For the rest of that night, and most of the next day, I felt like a ghost in my own home, as Jessica made it crystal clear that some jokes were off limits. Finally, at a quiet Sunday dinner, I apologized once more, and that evening she allowed me to snuggle up beside her in bed. I heaved a quiet sigh of relief and vowed never again to joke about switching sisters. Strangely enough, on one of our first dates, Jessica once told me a story about having taken Brittany's place on a date with a high school kid. I recalled another incident a few weeks before our wedding, when this topic had come up again during a trivial argument over which hotel to choose for our honeymoon in Caracas. Of course, I caved in to her wishes, but while we were bantering, I half-joked that if she didn't want me, perhaps I should marry one of her sisters. Jessica retorted, "I don't think they'd take you, baby. Brittany and Ashley aren't deep sleepers, and you snore," I quipped back. "Well, if I can't have Brittany or Ashley, then I guess I'll just have to stick with you." And that was that. I never understood why, a few years later, she got so incensed when I made the same joke again. Then came the most shattering moment. Our attempt to conceive turned my world upside down. We'd been trying for about 10 months. I'd heard that some couples took a year or 2 to get pregnant, so I wasn't overly worried at first, but Jessica grew increasingly anxious over our lack of success and insisted I see our doctor. I had a bit of fun sitting in that cramped room, filled with outdated adult magazines while I got tested, waiting for the call. On a Friday at work, I closed my office door and chatted briefly with Dr. Reynolds. "Scott," he said, "your sperm count is a bit lower than average, about 70% of what it should be for a man your age. But don't worry. Your sperm are healthy and strong. It might just take a little longer for you and Jessica to conceive." I left feeling relieved and eager to share the news with Jessica, but somehow, at dinner that night while we discussed Cincinnati politics, I completely forgot to mention it. It only came back to me around 11 p.m. when the sisters' usual nightly gathering filled our kitchen. I turned on the TV to watch basketball, and as I drifted off to sleep, the news about my sperm count nagged at me. I grabbed my robe and headed downstairs, determined to tell Jessica we had nothing to worry about. As I neared the kitchen, I caught a burst of loud, cheerful laughter coming from behind the swinging door where the sisters were chatting. I paused for a moment, smiling to myself at how much fun they always seemed to be having together, and I couldn't help but eavesdrop on their conversation. It was completely innocent, or so I thought, until I heard voices. "Well, if he isn't the best, why do you always want to switch with me?" One voice teased. Another giggled. "I didn't say that Derek isn't the best. I just said he doesn't caress as skillfully as Scott does." A third voice chimed in. Or is it still the second one, I can't tell. Followed by, "Besides, you greedy gal, you still get Derek more nights every week than any of us, plus the weekend." Another voice interjected, "So you really shouldn't complain about your situation." Their laughter rang out, and I sat there, stunned beyond belief. I couldn't fathom what I was hearing. Switching husbands for sex? I quietly sank into a chair, trying to steady my thoughts as I absorbed every word. It soon became clear. Jessica had planned for Kevin to get her pregnant if my sperm didn't bounce back soon. I realized then that Kevin and I weren't so different. Even though he's a few inches taller and shares my hair and eye color, unlike Derek, who's shorter and heavier. I sat frozen, feeling the sudden collapse of my once happy marriage. Amidst my swirling thoughts, I noticed that the coffee clutch on the kitchen counter was falling apart. I retreated quietly to our bedroom and lay there stunned, knowing I'd never be able to confront Jessica without thinking it through, and truthfully, I wasn't even sure which sister might be joining her that night. After calming down, I noticed one of the girls slipped into our bed, mistaking me for already asleep. She softly kissed my cheek and murmured, "I love you, baby," just as Jessica used to say. I struggled to keep from shouting, "You cheater," but I stayed still, waiting for her to fall asleep. After an hour, certain that she was out, I pondered how easily the wives could swap partners just for a night. Switching clothes during their nightly gatherings wasn't too hard, given that they all worked as part-time co-managers at an interior design store. The only hiccup would be on weekends when we were all supposed to be with our own wives. Yet even then, they'd simply adjust the schedule. I marveled at the fact that none of us ever grew suspicious. I mean, can't you tell your own wife apart from another woman? At least, that's what I always believed before everything changed. Not long ago, Jessica and I used to lie in bed and talk for hours about our day, our plans, our relationship. But somewhere along the line, she started cutting our late-night conversations short. After hanging out with her sisters, she'd just climb into bed muttering, "I'm too tired, honey. Let's talk tomorrow." For years, all our meaningful discussions happened during dinner or earlier in the evening. It seemed like a deliberate strategy. Women who swap partners often keep quiet at night so they aren't caught forgetting something important. Once I was sure Jessica was fast asleep, I crept into our home office, grabbed our ink pad, and dabbed some permanent black ink on my fingertip. I then returned to the bedroom and carefully marked a small spot on her back, just about halfway between her shoulder blade and her shoulder, no bigger than a pencil eraser. It was so subtle that she wouldn't notice unless she looked closely in the mirror. I washed my finger in the bathroom, but the ink only faded slightly, and after a while it became so dull that no one would think twice if they saw it. I smiled grimly, contemplating my next move. The initial shock had passed, replaced by deep anger. If what I overheard was true, then Jessica had been cheating on me methodically for years. It seemed she and her sisters had placed their bond above the love and loyalty they owed their husbands. I felt used, deceived, and humiliated. I tried to imagine a way to fix things, but I just couldn't see any. That Saturday afternoon, we all gathered for a barbecue at Kevin's house. I waited until the women were inside, probably busy preparing food, while Kevin manned the grill. I asked Derek if he wanted to take a walk around the block. He was always keen on exercising a bit. Once we were a safe distance away from the house, I said, "Derek, can I talk to you about something personal for a couple of minutes?" He agreed, and I began by insisting that our conversation remain between us. No word to Jessica, Ashley, Brittany, or Kevin. I casually mentioned I was mulling over a trip for next summer, maybe to Greece, and then, in a moment of vulnerability, I admitted that Jessica and I only made love once or twice a week, though I longed for more frequent intimacy. "I'm just wondering," I continued, "if her sisters get the same kind of attention." Derek, with a hearty slap on my back, laughed and said, "I'm afraid you got the short end of the stick, buddy. Ashley and I practically get together every night, sometimes even skipping a night if one of us is off." He grinned, teasing, "Maybe you chose the wrong sister." I forced a disappointed smile, hiding the storm raging inside, and pressed on. "Has it always been this way from the start?" Derek thought for a moment before explaining that he and Ashley had always maintained a little routine, almost like a game, where, every evening, after the sisters gathered in someone's kitchen, he'd be in bed reading or watching TV until Ashley came in with that sultry greeting, "Well, big guy, how do you want me tonight?" And then, after some suggestion and laughter, they'd follow their familiar routine. I asked him if the same applied to Jessica and our marriage, and he chuckled. "I guess some couples just keep their serious talks for dinner while leaving the bedroom for, well, just sleeping and sex." On our walk back, Derek joked about the Cincinnati Bengals, his one true love aside from Ashley, while my thoughts drifted darkly, full of anger and disbelief. I managed to push through that tense afternoon and evening without completely falling apart, even though people noticed I was a bit withdrawn. Determined to last one more day, I took Jessica out for her favorite Indian food around 10 p.m. Afterwards, as usual, she spent some time with Brittany and Ashley. When she finally came back and we were getting ready for bed, I walked up behind her, gently stroked her neck and shoulders, and searched for the ink mark. It wasn't there. It's all over now, I thought bitterly, and whoever was in my bed last night is about to feel the heat. I teased her lightly about a scratch on her leg, asking, "How's that little scratch? Let me see." She hesitated, then replied softly that she'd gotten a little bump when she hit the dishwasher door after dinner. I leaned in and, after a careful inspection, remarked, "There's nothing left now." She sighed in relief, and I grinned inwardly. This confirmed that whoever was with me the previous night wasn't the same one tonight. A few minutes later, as I lay in bed waiting for her, Jessica emerged from the bathroom. "Hey, honey, let's finish tonight the way we did yesterday. It was amazing," she said. I teased, "Well, maybe you're not really Jessica tonight. Maybe I got lucky with Brittany or Ashley. I can't be sure." Jessica's face shifted from amusement to alarm. "Scott, this isn't funny. How could you even joke about that?" she snapped. I reached out to hug her, but she pulled away and announced she was off to take a shower. Later, when we finally settled in, she tried to explain that she was just too tired and wasn't in the mood for wild antics that night. I suggested we take it slow and gentle, and she agreed, murmuring that she just wanted to please me. We ended up having ordinary, everyday pleasant lovemaking, the kind that married couples share. Nothing more extravagant than that, even though I'd always believed it was my wife, Jessica, and nothing else. Then came the day when everything unraveled. Sunday began with brunch at our favorite downtown diner, Trentino, with all three couples together. After that, we headed to Derek and Ashley's place, where the men watched the Bengals game while the sisters chatted and laughed away the hours. I had spent the morning keeping Jessica from calling her sisters, sensing that she was angry because my Friday night escapade, whoever it might have been, hadn't been properly disclosed to her. At the restaurant, barely 10 seconds after our drinks were ordered, Jessica fixed a pointed look on one of her sisters and said, "Ashley, I need to powder my nose. Could you come with me?" They left, leaving Jessica looking sullen, while Ashley appeared confused. When they returned, they both looked pale and worried, fumbling with their drinks and trailing off mid-conversation. I suspected that Jessica had blamed Ashley for not telling her about what went on the previous night. Ashley maintained that nothing had happened, but both she and Brittany started looking very uneasy. Even Brittany, who had been chatting happily earlier, eventually sensed that something was terribly wrong. As we finished our eggs Benedict, salmon omelet, and Belgian waffles, Brittany casually mentioned that one of her contacts was troubling her and needed checking on. When they returned, the three sisters sat silently at the table, avoiding eye contact and participating in almost no conversation. Their nervousness persisted throughout the day, which oddly gave me a grim satisfaction. Meanwhile, Kevin, Derek, and I enjoyed the Bengals finally winning a game, but the women were huddled in the back of the house in silence for hours. When it was time to leave, none of them could meet my gaze, and we exchanged awkward goodbyes. At home, I put on a cheerful act, telling Jessica funny stories about work and upcoming vacations, but her responses were monosyllabic and strained. I could see the terror in her eyes. Later that evening, while we were cleaning the kitchen and watching TV, Jessica suddenly announced, "Honey, I'm going to see Ashley for a while." I casually replied, "Sure, baby." But then, with a flat tone, she added, "I'll probably pack my things and put them in the car later this week." I couldn't hide my shock as I asked, "Scott, what are you talking about? Why would you pack your things?" Jessica hesitated before blurting, "Because I'm leaving. I can't live with a lying, cheating woman." I barely had time to register her words before she gasped, "I don't understand." Her sentence trailed off. I simply said, "See you when you get back," and walked toward the stairs, ignoring her desperate plea to stop me. I grabbed my suitcase and left the house without looking back, even as I heard her crying in the kitchen. I spent an agonizing, sleepless night in a shabby motel, and the next morning I took a day off work to meet with a lawyer and then went straight to the bank. In a flurry, I arranged a lunch meeting with Derek and Kevin, which forced Kevin to cancel a scheduled meeting. We sat in a booth at a diner, ordered sandwiches, and I blurted out, "Guys, I don't know if you'll believe this, but our wives have been cheating on us. They've been sleeping with all three of us for years." Derek was utterly shocked, but Kevin simply nodded and said, "I suspected something was off." I couldn't believe it, but we all exchanged dismayed looks. I explained that I'd noticed too many lapses in Brittany's memory of our conversations to ignore it. I had even recorded the conversation from the night before as evidence. When I played the tape, both Derek and Kevin listened in grim silence. Afterward, they called their offices to say they wouldn't be coming in that day. I told them I was filing for divorce from Jessica, and there was no turning back. In that moment I realized, ironically, that I'd never felt closer to my two brothers-in-law. They were good guys, and I would miss them. I found a new apartment, hauled a few pieces of furniture with a rented truck, and by week's end I'd cleared out the rest of the house. Jessica called me repeatedly at work and on my cell, but I had my assistant screen her calls and even changed my number, keeping my old one hidden. I filed for divorce and began planning my future. That Thursday, I ended up having a strange conversation with Emily, a friend from work. Everyone at the office could tell I was distracted and angry, but she still asked about what was going on. I practically told her the whole sordid story, and her face mixed surprise, sympathy, and a disturbing hint of perverse pleasure. That infuriated me, and I snapped, "I'm so sorry, Scott," she began, but I cut her off. "I'm not happy about what they did to me," I said, even as I recalled how I'd always thought Emily and I might make a good couple. I'd always known she was attractive, tall, beautiful, and generous, but I was so in love with Jessica that I never considered anyone else. Now, though, after everything, it suddenly occurred to me that there were other women in the world. Emily and I kept our conversations secret, but I could tell she sensed I was seeing her in a completely new light. Through my lawyer, Jessica begged to meet with me and explain herself, though I was convinced she couldn't offer anything that would change the situation. Still, I met her in a conference room about 6 weeks after I moved. Sitting alone, I waited until she entered, looking sad but still beautiful. I started, "Jessica, how are you doing? Are you already pregnant with Kevin's child?" She blushed and replied, "No, Scott, I'm not sleeping with Kevin or anyone else. I'm not going to get pregnant by anyone but you." I reminded her that the other night I'd almost interrupted her conversation with the sisters, and added, "Dr. Reynolds said my sperm might be a little low, but strong enough to make a baby. There's no need to rely on Kevin." But then I pointed out that she continued having sex with Kevin and Derek on a regular basis. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pleaded, "Scott, please let me explain." I warned her, "Just don't tell me how much you love me or that nothing's changed. Just explain." Jessica confessed that the escapades with her sisters had started back in school, a silly game that spiraled out of control, where they'd tease each other about each other's husbands. They'd even joked about swapping partners, and before long it became a regular thing. It was only a few times a year at first, she admitted, but then it grew more frequent. Brittany finally added that the three of them had started rotating between 3 husbands, like a small, bizarre dance. I asked, "So does that mean you've been splitting time between Kevin and Derek every week?" Jessica mumbled something about 1 or 2 nights for Derek, but she couldn't give a clear answer. My mind reeled with the realization that I'd been completely played. I told her flatly, "I've heard enough. You've been cheating on me with all 3 of them." Jessica's eyes filled with pleading tears as she tried to explain, but I couldn't take it anymore. "You put Ashley and Brittany above me. You were going to get Kevin pregnant without even telling me, and now you can have them. But you're not getting me back. I've had enough." I stormed out of the room in tears, and though Jessica cried out after me, I didn't stop. That night, I spent a sleepless, angry night, holed up in a rundown motel. The next day, I took time off work, met with a lawyer, and began planning my escape from our shared life. Later that day, I had a bizarre conversation with Emily, who kept hinting that maybe we'd be a good match. I told her I was too consumed by what had happened, but even so, I started to consider that maybe there were other options out there. A few weeks later, Jessica pleaded with me one last time in a meeting arranged by my lawyer. We sat in his conference room, and I couldn't help but ask her, "Did your sister sleep with me while we were dating?" She blushed and admitted that it had happened a couple of times before things got serious. I couldn't believe it. I told her, "I guess I passed the test since you never left me, but you played me like a fool so that you and your sisters could have your fun. You've been sleeping with Derek instead of me for years because he was better in bed, and you never thought about how that would make me feel." My anger rose as I realized that, despite our past promises, our marriage had been nothing but a series of twisted arrangements where our relationship always came second to their sisterly bond. I finally stood up and declared, "I'm done. I can't live with a woman who lies and cheats with the help of her own sisters. You can share Derek and Kevin if you want, but I'm not staying." Jessica burst into tears, pleading that she didn't want any more of them. She only needed me. I retorted bitterly, "It's too late. You chose them over me, and now I choose to be without a woman who's made a complete mockery of our vows." I left that day, not looking back, as the sound of their crying echoed behind me. In the days that followed, I started seeing Emily. After our 3rd date, I realized there were other women in the world with whom I could share real intimacy. Emily was energetic, grateful, and our first night together turned into a wild, unforgettable weekend. We still see each other and share moments, but nothing's rushed. She understands how confused I feel, and that means a lot to me. Meanwhile, Derek decided not to kick Ashley out, though he did force her to grow her hair long so she could never secretly switch partners again. He warned her that if she ever messed around again with me, Kevin, or anyone else, she'd be left penniless. Kevin, on the other hand, landed a great job in Chicago and told Brittany she could either move there with him or stay in Cincinnati with her sisters. Poor Brittany was caught in a terrible bind. She simply couldn't let go of Kevin, yet she couldn't bear to be apart from her sisters either.